Let's talk real quick about data collecting methods that are used within the social sciences, including sociology, of course. Now, most of the data collection methods that are used generally fall into one of four categories. They tend to either be surveys or some form of observation, some kind of analysis of existing sources, or an experiment. So we'll take a look at each one of those things here in just a minute. Now, in most studies, social scientists must carefully select who's going to be involved in their study. Now, this is important, and it involves usually selecting a sample of subjects, because generally you cannot study the entire population that you're going to research. So generally speaking, we choose samples. We take a sample, and a sample is simply a subgroup of the population. Now, samples need to be drawn randomly, and what that means is that every single subject within the population has an equal chance of being selected. For it to be a scientific research, it has to be random. Don't confuse that with a lot of the non-scientific polls that you hear about a lot of times in media reports. For example, when a TV or a radio show, they urge their listeners to, either text in or send in their responses or their views on a certain topic. Obviously, that's not random. Only the people who are listening to that TV or radio show are going to participate, and even then, it's only the ones that have time to actually sit down and write up their views. So, that's not random in any way, shape, or form, and so therefore that's not a scientific sample. So, when we talk about the population or the sample, anytime we talk about a sample, it has to be a random sample. A random selection from the population. Okay, let's talk about some of the methods here. First one we'll look at is a survey. Now, a survey, you've probably taken 8,213,000 of these by this point in time in your educational career. A survey, generally speaking, is either written or verbal. If it's written, we call it a questionnaire. If it's verbal, we call it an interview. Simple as that. So now the wording of the questions, how you frame a question, that can have a huge impact on the results you get. But we aren't going to go into all that. But generally, as long as you know what a survey is, and I think you do. Observation. Now, when we talk about observation, this is used a lot in the social sciences. There's three basic types. Naturalistic observation. And that's where you observe someone in their own natural habitat, their own natural setting, without their knowledge. So they don't know you're watching, and everything they do is totally natural because they don't realize that anybody's checking them out, so to speak. Participant observation. Participant is when the observer actually participates along with the group that they are researching. Okay, now this can be done in a number of ways, and it can be done with or without the group's knowledge. So someone may be secretive and just join a group and be kind of undercover, so to speak, and watching to see what goes on, or it may be blatant, where the group knows that a person's there. And it may alter a few people's responses or types of behavior, for a short-term period. But, for the most part, a participant, if they're going along with the group doing the same thing, most people tend to behave the same that they normally would. Now, the last one, and I have to admit this is my favorite, is what we call directed or controlled observation. Directed or controlled, and that's where basically you set up, the researcher sets up a situation, and then they stand back to watch and see how people respond to it. Now, if you're old enough, or if you've been able to watch some of the old TV, Candid Camera was one of the greatest TV shows in history, and candid camera used directed or controlled observation. They would set up a scenario, and then they would watch to see how people would respond to that scenario. One of my all-time favorites was when they actually went into a very expensive, exclusive restaurant, and they went into the women's room of that restaurant, and they had a hidden camera in, I guess you'd call it the lounge area of that restroom, not the business end, but the lounge area. And they took a life-size model of a nude male model, and it was a statue. And they put this up on a kind of a pedestal type thing and set it right smack dab in the middle of the women's restroom. And then they watched as people came in. All I can say is shame on you ladies. Because the only thing this thing had was a little bitty drop cloth wrapped around its waist. And on the drop cloth, it had a little note that says, please don't touch. But virtually every woman that came into that restroom, they would sneak a peek to see what was underneath the drop cloth. And of course, when they did, lights and sirens went off in the entire restaurant. So everybody became aware. All right, that's a good example of candid camera, which is also a good example of controlled or directed observation. Okay, now let's talk about another method, and that is the historical method. This is basically just analyzing materials from the past that already exist, whether you look at utensils or tools that people have used. You could look at toys. You can also look at books, magazines, diaries, any of that stuff. But it's basically going back and looking at stuff that already exists and trying to come up with conclusions about human behavior at the time. Now, next one is what we call the case study. And the case study is the study of a person, or it could be a problem, a social issue, or even a small group. But you're going to look at that person or group or issue in depth. You're going to go head over heels and look at everything you can find. Now, that may also include using surveys or observation, or even a historical approach kind of combined within that case study. But the case study, again, when you're going totally in depth, looking at a certain, either a person, problem, or group. Okay? And content analysis. Now, content analysis, basically you're looking at the content within a specific area. For example, you may examine how frequent a particular idea or an object is present in documents or in movies, TV shows, whatever the case. For example, you might look for violent acts within movies, or women in leadership roles on TV, or maybe sexual content in advertisements. Okay, you're looking for very specific things, and you're analyzing the content of what you're examining. Okay, now the last thing that we'll take a look at is experiments. Okay, and sometimes researchers may wish to kind of artificially create a situation that allows the researcher to manipulate the independent variable pretty easily. So the experiment, if you're going to do an experiment, it needs to be as objective as possible. And in many experiments, groups of people are actually selected for the experiment based on certain characteristics, such as you want people of a certain age group, or maybe a certain education, or a certain sex. Okay? And once you get that, that large number of people, that would be your sample, then the subjects are randomly assigned to one of two groups for the experiment. And those two groups we refer to as the experimental group and the control group. Now, the experimental group is the group who always experiences the independent variable, whatever the independent variable is, whatever the main point of that research is, that's the group that's going to experience that. Okay? The control group is the group who will go through the entire experiment, but they never experience the independent variable. So they're kind of used for comparison. So, for example, let's take violence on television. Okay? Let's say that you get your pool of subjects. Okay, this is the subjects that you randomly drew from the population. And that's right here. Okay, those are your subjects. Now, you randomly assign those people to one of two groups, the experimental or the control. All right? Now, we're wanting to study, let's say, the effect of watching violence on television upon violent behavior. So the experimental group is going to be exposed to violence on TV. So let's say that they watch 3 hours a day of whatever, something that's violent, okay? Lethal Weapon movie, you know, the Lethal Weapon movie. Or they watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or, you know, something of that nature, where there's a lot of violence within the program. Now, the control group, we have to treat them the exact same. So if the experimental group's watching 3 hours of TV, they have to watch 3 hours of TV. But they're not going to watch violence. So let's say that we put them in a room and we have them watch 3 hours of a movie on the history of trees. Wow, that might even cause you to be violent, I'm not sure. But now, the key is, after both groups have experienced the programs, okay, the 3 hours of watching TV, then we're going to put them in the same scenario. Let's say that our groups were actually little kids, and we have them watch, you know, programming, and then we put them out on a playground or something of that, you know, notion where all the kids have access to the same toys, the same activities and all. And then we watch, you know, how many kids go for the guns, or how many kids push others down, how many kids, you know, do something that we would consider violent. We would have to operationally define what we mean by violent, okay, violent behavior, so on the playground. Now, we'd also take and see how many times that the non-violent group or the control group, how many times did they commit violent behavior. And I will tell you, in the research that has been done over many, many years, watching violence on TV, it does tend to lead to violent behavior. So we have found, and this is not just with kids, it's even adults, where it tends, you know, even adults get kind of caught up in it or emotional, and they tend to do more violent activities. So, all right. Those, what we've covered now, are various methods that are used in sociology. They're used in all the social sciences, whether it's psychology, anthropology, or whatnot. Okay? Let's stop at this point.